So tonight we're going to do some arithmetic because it appears that one side of the political aisle is fully incapable of doing third grade math. So we're going to talk about the big C. No, not the one that actually kills people. The one that seems to only kill the elderly and the morbidly obese. It doesn't really seem to kill people at a very high rate. Yeah, the one that starts with a CO that I don't want to mention because this information is going to be, I'm 100% certain, yeeted if you guys go ahead and share it. But just to stick it to Jack, Mark, and Susan, please share this video because this is what's going to get actual arithmetic out, what's going to get actual statistics out. And everything I'm going to cite, again, is like the Johns Hopkins University. It is like the Centers for Disease Control. There is going to be population statistics compiled by the Census Bureau. But hey, this will probably get flagged anyways, so let's do it just to spite them. And on that note, if you are sick and tired of going onto Facebook and seeing videos like this, which are entirely true and based on basic arithmetic derived from information that is well recognized and well accepted within scientific communities as the truth, then you need to get on MeWe. I'll put a link in this video's description to how you guys can follow me on MeWe because honestly, I'm very passively using Facebook at this point. I'm very passively using Twitter at this point. MeWe seems to be a wonderful replacement for Facebook, and I highly recommend you guys get on MeWe, which has proved itself to be absolutely in favor of actual free speech and actual dialogues. So, on that note, let's perform some basic arithmetic. And we are going to start with, excuse me while I make our transition. We are going to start with some statistics from the US. And again, I'm going to do my best not to mention the actual C word, but you guys will be able to see it up on screen. So these are the deaths attributed to coronavirus. And I just broke my own rule. 10 seconds in. All right. So these are the deaths that have been attributed to the big C. And you can see how this, if we break this down and if we go down to our charts, we can see our total active cases. This is total cases. So this is a cumulative total. And our daily new cases here in the United States, our active cases in the US, and our daily deaths. So there's a few things to glean right away, just from the visual aesthetic of these graphs. One is that we have nowhere near as many cases at the beginning of all of this, and way more cases. So this should be cause for panic, because cases are all we care about, right? We don't care about outcomes. Then in that case, maybe we should concern ourselves with HPV, where something like 50% of everyone who goes to college is going to at some point contract HPV, despite the fact that there is a vaccine for HPV. Yeah, so there is a vaccine for that disease, and the positivity, the likelihood of coming down with HPV in college is 1 in 2, and it's higher for men than women, apparently. So how about we shut down universities? How about we take the entire university and college system and ban it forever because HPV? Oh, I know what you're going to say. Well, HPV affects basically no one. You get a pap smear and you're screened for cervical cancer, and for women, you're fine. And for men, there's really no adverse outcomes. You get a little canker sore and a little bump every once in a while, and as long as you can tolerate a little canker sore and a bump once in a while. I mean, how many asymptomatic carriers are there of HPV? An awful lot, right? So we care about outcomes. So do you care about outcomes or do you not care about outcomes? So let's go to the one outcome that everybody can agree on. And when I say can agree on, I'm talking about the fact that there is no scale for the thing. It's absolutely binary, and that is deaths. And that's our cases, and that's our deaths here in the United States. And this matters. And for the exact reason we just said, you don't make policy decisions on cases. You make policy decisions on on outcomes, because no one dies because of HPV. Tons and tons and tons and tons of people smoke weed nowadays. How many people how many people overdose from weed each year? How many people get into car accidents specifically because of, and only because of, weed? How many is it? 1? 2? Yeah. Yeah, so the same side that wants to legalize weed because its outcomes are harmless, and I'm kind of in agreement with them on that it should 100% be legal, And as Larry Sharpe says, taxed like an onion and treated like an onion and legislatively. Yeah, that side, do they care about outcomes? Yeah, so let's look at these outcomes. And we're going to do some arithmetic. Because just looking at these aesthetics, there's not much we can glean, right? What we can glean, however, is that the beginning of these daily deaths, wow, we have one heck of a peak over here on the left. And we're not kind of at that peak yet. And we had a little spike in the middle here in the middle of the summer, right? Little spike. And the spike right now seems to be taller than the spike over the summer. And a lot less than the spike over here in April and May and such. And then we look at cases. Way, 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 way fewer cases in April and March. And way, 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 way more cases in November and December. So then what is it then? Have things gotten better? Could it be possible? And I'm not suggesting that it is. Could it be possible that outcomes have gotten better? Or could the positivity be a result of a tremendous increase in testing? So here we don't have a whole lot of cases, right? We're peaking out around 35 or so thousand cases way back in March and April. But also back in March and April, we're peaking at almost 3,000 deaths a day. Whereas here, I mean, our absolute peak is maybe coming close, but realistically, if we're doing a 7-day mean, it's probably going to work out to a lot less. So what can we do with this information? Well, we can look at testing results. And so let's look at testing. Oh, wow, how about that? So what you might not be able to see all that well is that in the background here, I'm going to make sure that OBS is actually capturing this correctly. And it is. Okay, good. So the dark orange is deaths. The dark blue line is positivity. And in the background, in that faded orange, is the testing. So this is way back in March where we have virtually no testing and a whole lot more testing. So maybe what we care about then in terms of determining a mortality rate is, and actually considering an outcome, right? And by the way, the reason we talk about deaths is because there's no controversy over death. You are either dead or you are alive. If we're talking about a broken bone, well, which bone is it and how broken is it? If we're talking about memory loss, well, how much memory loss and compared to what, right? Because if you experience memory loss when you're 85, well, what kind of memory loss would you experience anyways when you're 85? Are we talking about a minor concussion or are we talking about actually unconscious for hours, borderline coma? Okay, that's why we talk about death. The other reason we talk about death is because on the scale of outcomes where you have no outcome, I should probably do this for you guys, where you go from no outcome to death. First things first, there's nothing worse than death in terms of outcomes in any scientific or measurable standpoint or empirical standpoint. And then there's nothing better than no outcome other than making you better somehow, like the like the worms in Futurama that infected Fry when he ate that sandwich from the gas station. However, what's the points that are in between that 0 and death, generally speaking, tend to scale with death. So if there's a point that's halfway here, whatever point that is, let's say that's fever and stiff cough, right, versus death. Well, if you only have half as many deaths, you're probably going to have half as many fevers and stiff cough, right? So it's a heuristic you can go by, but deaths are something that's really easy to conglomerate and to review as a data point. And it kind of gives us some insight in terms of outcomes generally without having to delve into a multi-hour review over each individual possible outcome, which is just completely impossible to do. So let's look at some test positivity. Right now, we are hovering around 10%. That's our 7-day moving average. It's impossible for me to find data without really, really digging through and doing a really tedious and pedantic process of going through individual states because all of these positivity rates are basically done on a state-by-state basis. So we're just going to use the 7-day moving average, and really that's what we care about anyways, because most states don't have results for Saturday and Sunday because these testing centers are, in many cases, these are understaffed or closed on Saturday and Sunday, and most people just aren't scheduling appointments on Saturday and Sunday. So you end up getting these over the weekend. You get almost no positive tests. and no cases reported. And then on Monday, you get this huge spike before it kind of levels off throughout the course of the week. That's why they use a 7-day moving average. And it's probably a reasonable thing to do. So not only do we have way more testing going on, why don't we actually figure out what that mortality rate is? Because the case fatality rate doesn't tell us anything if we're not doing all that much testing, or if we're only testing the most critical patients, if we're only testing the ones that are, in the IR to begin with. So, ICU to begin with. So what we can do is we can extrapolate that. And what we know is that deaths, of course, fall behind positive test results. So let's look how far behind they fall. So if we go to new cases, so our peak over the summer was right around third or so week of July. Where's our peak over the summer in terms of death? First, maybe second week of August. So about 2 weeks behind. Okay. So where is our early peak in cases? That's probably about first or so week of April, maybe first or second week of April. And this is tail end of April, third, fourth week. So again, we're talking about 2 weeks behind, maybe a little bit more. And if we go down to, let's say a state I'm familiar with, which is the state I live in. Let's go into Connecticut, where, of course, we don't have the second spike, because what happened in Connecticut was that COVID ran roughshod over the state. Everyone got it, and then we built up, I can't say it, but it starts with an H, the first word, and the second word starts with an I. Yeah. So this is a case where we've taken the cases and deaths to a whole new extreme, where cases are, in excess of double what they were back in April and May, and our deaths are a tiny fraction of what they were back in April and May. So what we can do is we can say, well, when did daily new cases start to increase in Connecticut? That was probably around the beginning of October, maybe late September. When did the deaths start to uptick? Probably around, that look like? That's a third week or so in October. So in every case, we're about 2 to 3 weeks behind our cases. Now, I know what everyone's going to say. Well, there are some cases where you don't get over COVID for months and months and months and months. Okay, but it appears as though what the data is trying to tell us is that perhaps many of these deaths are happening about 2 to 3 weeks after diagnosis. To make it a nice even number, let's call it a month. So what we can do is we can total, if we go back to the US, we can total up all of these data points in November. And man, is that a brutal thing to do. Sorry, that's cases. We can do that with deaths. And man, is that a brutal thing to do. And it would be kind of unfair to ask you guys to zoom in as far as possible and use your mouse and kind of figure that out. So I did that for you. So, and excuse me while I get that pulled up. Sorry, that's the wrong sheet. So these are our deaths. Excuse me. Let me get to... Oh, okay. I had this broken down as far as deaths. Okay, here we go. So these are our deaths for the entire month of November. So remember, we can total that up, and that's 37,886. Again, according to worldometers.info. All right. So what's the other thing we can do here? All right. So we go to the Johns Hopkins University page, and we can find out, and we can, excuse me here, we can determine the test positivity rate. Now, right now, it's at, around 10%. But the positive tests that are happening for the deaths in November are happening in October. So what we need to do is find a rough average for the positivity rate in October. Well, unfortunately, this graph, of course, means that we got to really zoom in and kind of look at it pretty terribly, because there's no data labels for the dates. And this is kind of a tough thing to do unless we zoom in. So I'm not going to zoom in for you. So you're going to have to just take my word for it that when I did this, and on October 1st, the positivity rate was 4.2%, and on October 31st, it was 6.6%. So what we can do, if we zoom in here, let's zoom in. Make it 200% so everybody can read that. So the mean of 4.2 to 6.6% is 5.4%. We can also determine from, according to the CDC, who uses the Census Bureau's data, that our population here in the United States is 328 million or so. So if we say that that data point of 5.4% positivity rate is useful, then what we can do is use it and extrapolate that to the population of the United States, because the number of tests that were performed in that period wasn't even 1 million tests, which means that we can't use the number of positive tests as our data point here. What we need to do is extrapolate that to the population. And if that data point isn't useful, then Ned Lamont, hello, doing your decision making based on a number that isn't useful, using a number that isn't useful. Yeah, let's see where we go with that. So we take that mean and we extrapolate that to the population. So we can say that it's reasonable to suggest that 17,724,934 people were actually likely infected during October. A percentage of them went and got tests. A percentage of those tested positive. That's 4.2%. That's 5.4% roughly. And since we have fairly linear growth, right, which we can see in the Johns Hopkins model, right, from October, in the period of October, we have, and we will actually have to zoom in on that roughly, fairly linear growth, right? It's not really exponential growth at any point in October. Right, so it's perfectly reasonable to use a running mean. So now, if we take that likely infected and extrapolate that 5.4% to, if we take that likely infected, we can get a projected mortality rate because we have the number of people who have died, 37,886 in that period. So in the period of October where all these people were getting tested, they were probably dying in November. So if we say all of November, that 37,886, we wind up getting a mortality rate of 0.21%. That's not 2.1%. That's 0.21%. And of course, this is with me doing things in such a manner that they're in favor of the lockdown perspective, in favor of the perspective that the big C is like airborne rabies. And yes, I want to start that meme. Let's get that meme going for airborne rabies. I'm stacking a deck against the arguments that you might make in favor of, against the lockdowns, in favor of the lockdown protesters, right? What do I mean by that? Well, we're using a 1 month period rather than the 2 week period that is probably better predictor of deaths, which means we're including a lot more deaths. The other thing we're doing is a running mean of a 7-day mean of positive tests where there's a clear test-taking bias. There's a clear bias in the experimentation, and that is it's an extension of the self-reporting bias, because you can't force people to take these tests, and you can't take a random sample of the population. In this case, the sample that's going out and getting tested is much more likely to be positive for these cases, because of course this is including people who are dead and who have died of corona. This is including people who are in ICUs, because in order to get admitted into an ICU, you have to check everyone for COVID. And it's also including the mountain of people who are showing symptoms and are genuinely worried about the outcome that might result from catching the disease, right? However, the people that are completely asymptomatic, well, they're less inclined to go and get tested. So this actually is probably an overprojection, never minding the fact that over that time period, we're talking about PCR tests, which return a ton of false positives. And on top of all of that, we're talking about in certain cases where people have actually died, attributing deaths to COVID that probably aren't due to the big C. So that's 2 now for me, 2 strikes for me. So that that of course is going to result in certain degrees of over-reporting, how much we don't know. But in this case, that 0.21% mortality rate is probably as high as it could reasonably be expected to go. Here's the other thing. We also know how the big C is spread throughout the ages. And we also know that there's one single factor that is a predictive comorbidity factor on top of age, which is obesity, which is incredibly easy to predict, incredibly easy to control for. It's actually avoidable, and it's apparently accounting for a ton of the comorbidity. So there's basically a single factor outside of age to actually control for when predicting mortality. So we all know that mortality rate is going to skew towards a certain class of people. And let's find out what class of people that is. So what we can then do is go to the breakdown of deaths by age. Now, unfortunately, this is a breakdown of deaths across the entire spectrum of the last, say, 8 or 9 months. And this is from the Centers for Disease Control. So what we can then do is do the exact same thing we just did and then extrapolate that. Of course, doing that for each group means that you have to build an Excel spreadsheet, and that could be tedious and time-consuming. So instead of making you do that, I did that. So this is a breakdown of deaths due to big C, and we can probably afford to zoom in on this. Let's see if I can find the zoom button. Let's make this 150%. So we have 39. This should actually be 29. Excuse me. This was a typo. 29 deaths under age 1. And you can kind of see as it results in a bar graph. Yeah, it's not even under age 15 really isn't even registering. So what does that look like in terms of a percentage? Because that's kind of an easier thing to consider. Well, here's our percentage. And the other thing is that we kind of don't care of the individual percentage of these data points. We kind of care about a cumulative thing because you can control for your own age up to a certain age. For example, I'm 34. I'm going to be turning 35. I can't ever be 33, but I can be 36 in the future. And since now I'm 34, the only thing I'm worried about is where I will be at a certain point, which will never be below 34 again. That's a confusing thing to say. So let's just look at the graphic. So in terms of the cumulative percentage, for those under age, aged 4 and under, we're talking about 0.02% of the deaths. And what we can do is we can go all the way up to age 35, where we're not at age 34, you still haven't gotten to even 1% of the deaths. Well, what does that predict? It says to you that the overwhelming majority of deaths are happening at ages 45 plus, not counting for comorbidities. See, that's an independent variable you should be controlling for, VOSH, and that you should control for, and that we're not going to control for, as a way to stack the deck against me as much as I possibly can. So remember what we did with that 4.2%. Right, so we projected our mortality. We can project our mortality now by age. So before we had 0.21%, and I'm going to zoom in to 150% so we can see this a little easier. So in all likelihood, if we're saying that 5.4% is what we're going to extrapolate to the whole of the entire period to get those 29 deaths, the likely infected is around 200,000, and our projected mortality, say for under age 1, is 0.1%. So now we're starting to really see what things look like long term. Now, of course, I said that this kind of stacks the deck against my case as much as you possibly can. Less than 0.1% for every age category below the age of 34, below the age of 35. We're going to get into what that kind of equates to and what a reasonable response would be for a projected mortality rate of 0.07%. That means survivability of 99.93%. Now, like I said, that 5.4% applies to a specific time period. The other thing to consider is that today is the first week of December. Today is not May. So when you're making policy decisions today, it should be in reference to data that's meaningful to today. So there are a lot of things we know about the Big C that we didn't know about back in March and April. For example, that respirators don't do a damn thing, and that you should probably just put somebody on straight oxygen over the mouth. There's a lot of things about how to treat somebody prior to getting to the ICU and prior to actually getting hospitalized. There's a lot of things to know about how to avoid recirculation, if you will. Which means that outcomes you would expect to be different today than they were in March and April. So what we should do is give a reflection of outcomes today. So if we take the monthly mean of those deaths, and again, the majority of them are probably going to be early on, as those initial graphs we just watched indicated that, way more deaths were happening way back in March, April, and May than even they are now. And we didn't have nearly the testing that we had back in March, April, and May, so there may have been some deaths we didn't account for back then. So what you should do is project the infection percentage, the positivity rate that we figured out from before, which we're applying to only 1 month. Let's apply that to an average month, which is 3 in the case of age under 1. And you know what we'll do just to make things easier? Let's copy this and let's make another column for this age so we can see this a little bit easier. So we take the monthly mean. We take our monthly mean, which for ages 1 to... whoops, I did that. I aligned something wrong here. There we go. For ages under 1, it's 3. For ages 1 to 4, it's 1. For ages 45 to 54, it's 1,155. So we can take that number and then divide by the likely infected, because we still have a breakdown of the people in that, of the population in that age group. So in the case of the age of 35 to 44, there's over 41 million people in that age group. So at 5.4% infected in October, there were probably 2.2 million people that were actually infected in that age group. And in all likelihood, around 434 of them died. Which means if you divide 434 by 2.2 million, your projected mortality rate is now 0.0193. So what does that mean? It's kind of irrelevant if we don't have a point to compare that to. So before we get to that point, what I did for the sake of simplicity is I extrapolated this tiny percentage into a mortality per 100,000. So this would be your deaths per 100,000 cases. And that's what we care about, because it's not the deaths per 100,000 people, it's the deaths per 100,000 cases. What's interesting is now that is, of course, we need to know what we can compare that to. And it's been compared because it's a coronavirus. That's 3 strikes. I should be ending the video soon. To another thing that's very similar to the Big C type virus, the common flu. So let's go ahead and do that. So this is, again, according to the CDC, cdc.gov/flu/about/burden/2018 to 2019. Of course, the reason you want to only look at 2019 is because you don't have Big C statistics tainting these results. And the mortality rate in 1 year should not be significantly worse from year to year in a country like the United States, in an OECD, first world, well-developed country with great medicine. Okay, so what we can do now is say aged 0 to 4 years. Our mortality rate estimate is 1.3, and that's per 100,000. And our projected range is 0.4 to 3.6. So then let's go back to our Excel spreadsheet. In fact, let's do something even better. Let's do a side-by-side capture. And let's zoom in, let's zoom right on in to that mortality per 100,000 per age group. Okay, and let me bring up the... All right, so this is as far zoomed in as I can get. So this is the common flu. In fact, we actually do need to zoom out of this so we can see our age group. 0 to 4, estimate 1.3. Well, what's our estimate? About 1.46. That's pretty good. How about our next age group? 5 to 17. Well, our predicted deaths, our mortality rate for the common flu is 0.4 per 100,000. How about for us? Well, we can't quite get to 17, but we can say 5 to 14 is 0.18, which is, wow, that's actually below 0.4. And it may be a little bit higher than that 0.18 because we stop on our Excel spreadsheet at age 14, and the CDC extends that to age 17. But well within our accepted range, 0.1 to 1.2. 18 to 49, 1.8. Now that's a huge age group, and I wish they could have broken this up into other age groups. But what we can do is say that that is clearly going to be much larger in the 18 to 49 group, because that includes 44 to 45, which is 52.31, and 35 to 44, which is 19.28. But in either case, what we're looking at from ages 15 to 24 is a mortality per 100,000 for the big C of 1.73, which is below the mortality rate for the common flu for ages 18 to 49. And even the common flu seems to skew towards the elderly. And of course, probably towards infants in the beginning there, but in some degrees towards the elderly. So what does that tell us, folks? I'll let you make your decisions. Are we really talking about, according to this data, according to this basic arithmetic, are we really talking about airborne rabies here? Or are we talking about comparing it in certain cases to the common flu? And if we're talking about certain cases, we know which cases those are. If you're 35 and under, are you going to be fine? Is this something we shouldn't be worrying about? How hard is it to say there's a certain segment of the population that should stay home? And since there seems to be a survivability here that's on par with something most people don't really concern themselves with, maybe the rest of that population goes out and gets it on purpose to develop a two-word phrase that starts with an H and starts with an I, which I can't say unless you guys want to share this to MeWe, where they actually believe in free speech. So I'd love to go ahead and get into the data for Connecticut in specific. So let's just do that in very, very, very brief form. And the reason I want to talk about Connecticut is because that's where I live. So let me just hurry up and get over to Connecticut. And I'm not sure why they don't list these alphabetically. Okay. So again, we go back to our daily new case chart. Lots and lots more cases. No major cases in the summer. And wow, that death chart is skewed very, very differently from what we saw for the national chart. So in Connecticut, all that arithmetic we just did should actually work out a whole lot better. Should actually work out a whole lot more favorably. And in fact, if we do things like daily testing in Connecticut, our current positivity rate is actually a whole lot less. Which means even if we're predicting the same mortality rate, the same likelihood, if you contract it, if it's less likely that you're contracting it, maybe it's of less concern. And by the way, let's look at this beginning here where we had an insane positivity rate. So what does that tell you about Connecticut? Because there's two ways to look at things. That the disease got here months and months and months ago. That disease got here probably in Connecticut in 2019, in December of 2019, maybe as early as November, probably not. But at least as early as January 2020, we did nothing. It ran roughshod over our state and killed off all of the people who were likely to be dying from it, which is why you don't have any spike in the middle of the summer and why we're barely experiencing a spike now in both cases in all forms of outcome. Or maybe coronavirus is this infinitely lethal airborne rabies. Which one sounds like the data is better fitting the conclusion? We can actually go into testing. So here's the other thing to consider. These are the deaths in Connecticut for elderly housing. We've got 3,417 deaths in elderly housing. We have 5,091 deaths that are confirmed and probable. That means that there are deaths due to the big C that we know are due to the big C, and deaths with big C. So the interesting thing is that if you divide this number, the 3,417, by 5,091, you find out that more than 2/3, over 67% of all deaths are happening in nursing homes. And in fact, if we scroll down to see where they are, it seems like they happened past tense in nursing homes, where we had a spike continuing on to the summer, a little bit of a spike at the very end of the summer, and have we flattened a curve? Is that what we're doing right here with these deaths? Does that look pretty flat to everyone? Yeah, so yeah, and just as another, just as a brief aside, so we want to go back to the countries, go back to USA, and go back to our deaths. So that's the breakdown across the US. It seems like right now things have progressed very differently in Connecticut than they have across the US. In fact, they seem to be doing a whole lot better. We seem in Connecticut to be doing a whole lot better than the rest of the United States. And if you're under a certain age, not controlling for any comorbidities, outcomes seem to be perfectly in line with another C word, which again, I can't say that sentence because free speech doesn't exist on certain platforms. So get on MeWe, folks. Link is in this video's description. Enjoy sharing this information with everybody. Enjoy showing people what arithmetic looks like. Enjoy giving people a lesson that they should have learned in 3rd grade.